Greetings, class. Today we begin our intensive study of the book of Revelation, approaching it not as a mysterious collection of symbols about distant future events, but as a concrete historical document written to address specific circumstances in the first century. Our primary thesis today centers on what I consider to be the most misunderstood aspect of Revelation, its intended audience and primary subject matter. I propose that while the book was addressed to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor, its central focus was the impending destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, not some distant eschatological event or the fall of Rome centuries later. Let me begin by addressing what I call the geographical objection, perhaps the most frequently raised argument against understanding Revelation as primarily concerned with Jerusalem's destruction. Critics ask, why would you write to churches in Asia about Jerusalem's fall? It's too far away. Why would they care? This objection reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both the book's distribution and the interconnected nature of first century Christianity. First, we must recognize that no biblical book was written exclusively for its immediate addressees. Every epistle, every gospel, every prophetic work was copied and distributed throughout the early Christian world. To suggest that because Revelation was initially sent to 7 churches in Asia, it therefore never reached Jerusalem, defies everything we know about early Christian communication networks. Of course, Jerusalem received this book. The question is not whether Jerusalem got the message, but why it was strategically sent first to Asia. Consider the geographical realities. From the island of Patmos, where John received this revelation, the distance to Jerusalem is approximately 625 miles as the crow flies. Yet many of these same critics who argue that Asia is too far from Jerusalem to care about its destruction simultaneously propose that the book concerns Rome's fall instead. Rome, however, lies 810 miles from Asia, 185 miles farther than Jerusalem. If distance invalidates concern for Jerusalem, how much more does it invalidate concern for Rome? Moreover, the sea route to Palestine was far more direct than the circuitous journey to Rome, which required navigating through numerous Greek islands and making difficult choices about northern versus southern routes. Any message about Jerusalem's destruction would have reached that city long before news could travel to Rome. The geographical argument, when examined closely, actually supports the Jerusalem interpretation rather than undermining it. But let me address the deeper issue here, the assumption that distance determines relevance. This reflects a profound misunderstanding of Jerusalem's significance in the first century world and particularly within the Christian community. Jerusalem was not merely another city. It was the mother city of Judaism, the birthplace of Christianity, and the spiritual center from which the gospel had spread to the very Asian churches receiving this letter. The Jewish population in Asia Minor was substantial. According to historical records, the 4th largest concentration of Jews in the world after Israel, Babylon, and Alexandria. These were not merely Gentile churches with no connection to Judaism. Many of their members were Jewish Christians who maintained deep ties to Jerusalem. They had family there, business connections, and spiritual attachments that transcended geographical boundaries. The destruction of Jerusalem would have profound implications for their understanding of God's purposes and their own identity as the new covenant people. To illustrate why this geographical objection fails so completely, let me direct your attention to a crucial Old Testament parallel that demonstrates God's established pattern in such matters. In Ezekiel chapter 4, we find the prophet in Babylonian captivity over 600 miles from Jerusalem, receiving detailed visions about Jerusalem's impending destruction. God commands Ezekiel to perform elaborate symbolic acts, carving a representation of Jerusalem under siege on a brick, setting up toy siege equipment, and lying on his side for extended periods to represent the years of Jerusalem's punishment. Notice what's happening here. A prophet, hundreds of miles away in Babylon, is given an extensive revelation about Jerusalem's fall and instructed to communicate this to other exiles equally distant from the city. No one finds this arrangement strange or questions why Babylonian exiles would need to know about Jerusalem's destruction. Yet when we encounter the same pattern in Revelation, a prophet on an island receiving visions of Jerusalem's fall and communicating them to churches hundreds of miles away, suddenly critics find this implausible.
Ezekiel's prophecy employs remarkably similar language and imagery to what we find in Revelation. He speaks of marking foreheads, of divine judgment coming through foreign armies, of the temple's desolation, and of God gathering the wicked into the city like metals in a smelting furnace to be melted by the fire of divine wrath. These are not coincidental parallels. They represent a consistent biblical pattern. When God intends to destroy a city, particularly Jerusalem, he reveals this purpose through his prophets to his people wherever they may be located.
Furthermore, Ezekiel explicitly states that Jerusalem was placed at the center of the nations as a light to teach them God's ways. Jerusalem's significance extended far beyond its geographical boundaries. Its destruction would demonstrate to all nations that God judges unfaithfulness even among his chosen people. This explains why such revelations were not confined to Jerusalem's immediate vicinity, but were proclaimed to God's people scattered throughout the world. Let me address another major objection: the question of dating. Many scholars insist on a late date for Revelation, placing its composition around 95 to 96 AD, well after Jerusalem's destruction. This late dating is based primarily on a single disputed passage from Irenaeus as recorded by Eusebius, writing some 200 years after the alleged events. However, careful examination of this passage reveals that the Greek text is ambiguous and has likely been mistranslated. The passage in question describes something being seen near the time of Domitian's reign. Traditional interpretation assumes this refers to when the book was written. However, the Greek construction more naturally refers to when John himself was seen. That is, when he was still alive and accessible for questioning about the book's meaning. By the time Irenaeus was writing, Christians were struggling to understand the symbolic number 666 in Revelation 13:18. Irenaeus suggests that if it were necessary to know the specific name this number represented, it would have been announced by him who saw the apocalypse, meaning John, who had lived until near Domitian's time but was no longer available for consultation.
This interpretation makes far more sense of the context. If the book itself had been written during Domitian's reign, there would be no mystery about its meaning just a few decades later. The fact that its symbolic elements had become difficult to interpret suggests the book was actually written much earlier, allowing time for the original context to become obscured. Internal evidence strongly supports an early date, around 65 to 68 AD. The book repeatedly emphasizes the immediacy of its fulfillment. 9 times it uses forms of the Greek word tachou, meaning shortly or quickly. When this word appears elsewhere in the New Testament, it consistently refers to events fulfilled within minutes, hours, days, or at most a few years. There are no clear examples where it refers to events centuries in the future. The opening verse declares that this revelation concerns things which must shortly take place. The closing chapters repeat this emphasis. The time is near, 1:3, I am coming quickly, 22:7, 12:20. If Rome's fall in 476 AD was the primary fulfillment, these time indicators become meaningless. Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD, however, fits perfectly with the book's temporal framework. Some argue that chapters 17 and 18, which describe the destruction of a great city called Babylon, must refer to Rome because of certain descriptive elements. However, careful analysis reveals that while 1 or 2 descriptions might fit Rome, the majority point unmistakably to Jerusalem. The destroyed city is called the Great City, where also their Lord was crucified, 11:8. An unmistakable reference to Jerusalem. It's described as guilty of the blood of prophets and saints and all who have been slain on the earth, 18:24, echoing Jesus' words in Matthew 23:35 about Jerusalem being responsible for all the righteous blood shed on earth, The symbolic name Babylon was commonly used by both Jewish and Christian writers to refer to any power that oppressed God's people, just as Egypt symbolically represented bondage. First century Jewish literature frequently applied Babylon to Jerusalem when it became apostate, and early Christian writers used the same terminology.
Now let me address the fundamental question. Why would God reveal Jerusalem's destruction to churches in Asia rather than directly to Jerusalem itself? This objection assumes that Revelation was intended as a warning to evacuate the city, but this misunderstands the book's purpose entirely. Revelation is not a warning about Jerusalem's fall, it's an explanation of why that fall was inevitable and what it would accomplish in God's purposes. Jerusalem had already been warned extensively about its impending destruction. Jesus himself had prophesied it in detail in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. The apostles had proclaimed it repeatedly. Stephen had died preaching about it. For 35 years, from Jesus' crucifixion until the city's actual destruction, Jerusalem had received warning after warning. They didn't need another warning. They needed an understanding of the theological significance of what was about to occur. The churches in Asia, however, needed something different. They needed to understand that when Jerusalem fell, it would not represent God's failure or the triumph of evil, but rather the fulfillment of divine judgment against a system that had rejected its Messiah. They needed to see that Christianity would not be swept away with Judaism's collapse, but would emerge as God's sole covenant people. They needed assurance that the dramatic events they were about to witness were not chaotic disasters, but ordered judgments proceeding from the throne of heaven. This is why the book is titled The Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's not primarily about revealing future events, but about revealing Jesus Christ himself, showing his divine authority, his active involvement in historical events, and his ultimate victory over all opposition. When the churches in Asia saw Jerusalem's temple destroyed and its sacrificial system permanently ended, they would understand that Jesus truly was the final sacrifice, the ultimate high priest, and the true temple where God met with his people. The book serves as God's grand finale to the Old Covenant era. For 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, the temple had continued to function alongside the nascent Christian church. Jewish Christians could still participate in temple worship while also gathering for Christian fellowship. This transitional period was ending. The destruction of Jerusalem would remove any possibility of returning to Old Covenant worship, making Christianity the only viable expression of true religion. Consider how this understanding transforms our reading of Revelation's symbolic imagery. The 24 elders represent the complete number of God's covenant people, 12 tribes plus 12 apostles. The 144,000 sealed ones represent the fullness of Israel saved out of the coming judgment, not a literal number of end-time saints. The great multitude from every nation represents the Gentile church that emerges from the Jewish remnant. These are not mysterious future events, but the historical process by which Christianity emerged from Judaism as God's universal religion. The 7 churches of Asia were strategically chosen not because 7 represents completeness or perfection, a numerological approach I find unpersuasive and lacking biblical foundation, but because they formed a natural communication network in that region. Historical evidence suggests they were connected by established Roman postal routes, allowing for efficient distribution of messages throughout the area. From these 7 centers, the revelation would spread throughout the province and beyond. Each of these churches receives specific personal messages in chapters 2 and 3, indicating that Jesus knew their particular circumstances, struggles, and spiritual conditions. These messages were not generic templates, but specific diagnoses and prescriptions for each congregation's situation. This personal knowledge demonstrates Jesus' active involvement in their lives and his authority to speak into their circumstances. As we move forward in our study, we'll examine how consistently this interpretive framework illuminates the book's symbolism. The beast from the sea represents imperial Rome in its persecution of Christians. The beast from the earth represents apostate Judaism in its collaboration with Rome against the church. The mark of the beast relates to the economic and social pressures Christians face to participate in emperor worship or to maintain their status within Judaism. The woman clothed with the sun who gives birth to the male child represents faithful Israel, bringing forth the Messiah, while the great dragon seeking to devour the child represents Satan working through whatever political powers he can influence. In this case, Herod's attempt to kill the infant Jesus. The woman's flight into the wilderness represents the church's protection during the period of tribulation leading up to Jerusalem's fall. The judgments described throughout the book, the seals, trumpets, and bowls, represent the progressive intensification of divine wrath upon Jerusalem and the Roman Empire's persecution of Christians. These are not future global catastrophes, but first-century events described in the symbolic language appropriate to apocalyptic literature. Throughout our study, we must remember that we're reading a book written in a specific literary genre, apocalyptic prophecy, which employs symbolic language to describe real historical events. The symbols are not arbitrary, but draw from a rich tradition of Old Testament prophetic imagery that would have been familiar to first-century Jewish and Christian readers.
This approach requires us to do serious historical work. We must understand the political situation in Palestine during the 60s AD, the relationship between Rome and the Jewish leadership, the position of Christians within both Jewish and Gentile communities, and the economic and social pressures facing the early church. We cannot simply impose modern concerns onto an ancient document. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that understanding Revelation as primarily concerned with first-century events does not diminish its relevance for us today. Rather, it enhances our appreciation for God's sovereignty in history and His faithfulness to His promises. The principles of divine judgment, the ultimate triumph of good over evil, and the assurance of God's people in times of trial remain as relevant today as they were in the first century.
The book of Revelation stands as a testament to the fact that Jesus Christ is indeed the Lord of history, that apparent defeats can be ultimate victories, and that God's purposes will ultimately prevail regardless of the opposition they face. As we continue our study in the weeks ahead, we'll see how this understanding brings clarity to passages that have long been shrouded in mystery and speculation. Your assignment for next week is to read Revelation chapter 1 carefully, noting the time indicators and geographical references. Pay particular attention to the description of Jesus in verses 12 to 20, and consider how this portrayal would have encouraged the churches facing persecution. We'll examine this Christological vision in detail as we continue our verse-by-verse analysis of this remarkable book. Remember, serious Bible study requires serious commitment. Read actively, question assumptions, and bring your observations to class for discussion. The truth of God's Word rewards careful investigation, and I promise that approaching Revelation with historical sensitivity and exegetical rigor will prove far more satisfying than treating it as a cryptic puzzle about distant future events. Class dismissed.